Well, good morning and welcome back. We are coming this morning to the prophet Habakkuk. And I found it. It's on page 871 in the Pew Bible. So if you want to find your way there. Habakkuk is the ninth of the minor prophets. There are 12 altogether. So we are well past halfway. In fact, 3/4 of the way through these studies. I was trying to figure out a way to help us all remember the chronological order. And I came up with a really pathetic mnemonic device. But you know, that's what makes them memorable, isn't it? Is how corny they are. So I was thinking about this, and I thought what you need to remember to get them in chronological order is that you're having the minor prophets for breakfast. Okay, that's where we start. And for breakfast, you always have OJ and jam. I warned you. All right, now the OJ is the 9th century prophets. That's Obadiah and Joel. Okay. The jam is the 8th century, but you have to insert an odd little H in there. So it's actually J-A-H-M. J-ham. Jam, you know. So that's Jonah, Amos, Hosea, and Micah. And those were all our 8th century prophets. And then I was really struggling this morning because then we come to the 7th century prophets, which we've been studying. There are 3 of them. And I was trying to think, how do you turn this into breakfast food? N-Z-H. N-Z-H. Nahum, Zephaniah, and Habakkuk. And I was really desperate. I didn't know, what I could come up with. And I asked Candy on the way to church this morning. This is true. This is a true story. I'm not making this up. I said, well, what's a mnemonic device for N-Z-H? And just like that, she goes, New Zealand Hills. But what does that have to do with breakfast? I don't know what to do with that. So you're going to have to imagine having breakfast on the New Zealand Hills. I know this is getting out of control. But anyway, I'm just trying to leave you something that you'll remember about these guys, 6 months from now, a year from now. That's the best I can do. So anyway, there we are. We're coming this morning to Habakkuk. Habakkuk is the last of these 7th century prophets. We're going to put him in the year 610. Then we make quite a leap. And the last 3 prophets are called post-exilic prophets. So they come after the Babylonian captivity. In some ways, it's appropriate that we're dealing with Habakkuk on Palm Sunday. Because in some ways, this is when Israel virtually dies. Goes into the grave of Babylon for some extended period of time, and then somehow is resurrected on the other side when they're restored to their land in 539 under Cyrus the Persian. And so in a sense, to have Habakkuk right now on Palm Sunday, looking forward to the death of Christ, burial, and then we'll come back on the other side after Easter Sunday, 2 weeks from today, and take the next of the prophets, who is a post-exilic prophet. That is a prophet who addresses the people of God after the exile, and that will be Haggai. And then, of course, the last 2, Zechariah and Malachi. And so we're timing it out pretty close here. I will, by the way, have, though, about 3 odd weeks, it looks like, now at the end of the year. And so I'm running out of prophets before I'm running out of time. And I certainly don't want to retire yet. So I thought what we'd do is come back and pick up one more of the prophets in a kind of quick survey of the book of Daniel. And so Daniel will spend more than 1 week. In fact, we'll probably spend whatever time we have left. Daniel is not considered a minor prophet. He's considered one of the major prophets, but he's the shortest of the major prophets. Only 12 chapters long, and could have been considered a minor prophet in terms of length, but simply traditional Jewish reckoning has made him one of the major prophets. So since I was a little uncomfortable skipping Daniel anyway, I think we'll just go back and pick him up and spend the rest of our time this year looking at Daniel. So with that little introductory thought, just to remind you then, the prophets we've looked at here in the 7th century, first of all were, as we indicated, Nahum. Nahum is the one who addresses the unexpected and indeed cataclysmic collapse of the great superpower of Assyria. And at the time that Nahum brought this prophecy, that seemed like the most unlikely and unexpected and unpredictable thing you could imagine. The greatest power, they'd been a power for some 200 years. There were certainly no signs that Assyria was on the verge of collapse. At that time, at the time of Nahum's prophecy, the greatest king of Assyrian history was still reigning very successfully. Ashurbanipal didn't look like he was going to be retiring anytime soon. And all of it made Nahum's predictions seem probably quite almost preposterous. And yet Nahum announced that it was only a matter of time, historically speaking, just heartbeats away from the great collapse of that Assyrian empire, which took place ultimately in 612 at the hands of the Babylonians and the Medians. Then the next prophet we looked at, 10 years later, Zephaniah, 630. Zephaniah, as you recall, we looked at last week, the one who kind of jump-starts the reign of the great king Josiah, when he's just a teenager, launches him really on a career of being a great reforming king. Zephaniah brings that original kind of jolting message to King Josiah, and then shortly after that, Jeremiah picks up the ball. Jeremiah is the prophet for the long haul. He says he began to prophesy in the 13th year of Josiah, which would be 627, and continued to prophesy, to be a kind of the mainstay prophet there in Judah for some 45 years, well past the collapse of Jerusalem at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, even some years after that. So Jeremiah has one of the longest careers, and it spans all of the time of Josiah and then quite a bit more beyond that. So anyway, that was Zephaniah was the prophet we looked at last week. This week then we come to this prophet Habakkuk. Habakkuk we're going to place at the year 610, 20 years then after Zephaniah, right at the end of the reign of Josiah. All three of these three prophets, all three of them are really associated with the reign of Josiah. And Habakkuk, again, has a remarkable text for us to review. It's a short book, and we'll spend some time looking at it. But before we do that, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Father, again, we are grateful that you have given to us this rich and remarkable opportunity to continue to consider these great men that you raised up in history to be the very mouth of Yahweh, the very word of the Lord, using human instruments to bring a heavenly truth to your people. And we know that in some ways, while these messages had very specific application to dates and places in history, in some other ways they are timeless. And that we can rightly ask, how do these words apply in our lives? And seek through your Spirit to have eyes to see and ears to hear your truth for us. And we pray that our reflection on this prophet and his message, Habakkuk, would be accompanied by the same Spirit that guided him when he first uttered these words. We ask you these requests in the name of Christ. Amen. If I can just again take a couple of minutes to try to continue to paint the historical story. If we get the history in our minds, then hopefully it'll help us appreciate Habakkuk's message. But you recall we were talking last week about Josiah. Josiah is a good king. He starts off young. As we indicated, Zephaniah seems to get him going in the right direction. He's a reforming king. In many ways, the Old Testament review of Josiah is that he is the greatest king of Judah outside those two, David and Solomon, kind of the golden age there. But Josiah comes and he is given rave reviews by the historians in the Old Testament. Notwithstanding that, though, however, it seems that in a moment of ill-advised strategy, he undertook a campaign against Necho. You recall what had happened? The surviving king of Assyria. Assyria is dead. Nineveh's collapsed. But there is one surviving king, a king without a kingdom. His name is Ashur-uballit. He escapes from Nineveh just before its collapse, runs to Haran, before it collapses to the Babylonians, he runs to a city called Carchemish. Carchemish is on the Euphrates, north of Judah and Syria. And that's where he's holed up, and he sends for help to the Egyptians, former enemies of his, and the new king Necho responds. And so the king is willing to go out and try to rescue Ashurbanipal. Josiah had been hearing all through the years the message of Jeremiah. Jeremiah had said, God is going to use the Babylonians to chastise not only the people of God in Judah, but this entire region. Now, the Babylonians were not good guys. We're going to see that in terms of Habakkuk's message. But they were going to be used by God. And so in some ways, Josiah probably thought he was going out to fight for the angels. Because here the Egyptians are going to take on the Babylonians. And the Babylonians are God's instrument. And so Josiah thought, I'm not going to let those Egyptians get in the way of God's purpose here. I'll go stop that Necho guy. And well, it was not Josiah's task. It wasn't his calling. You know, he'd heard Jeremiah, right message, wrong application. We can do that. We can have the right theology and go the wrong direction with it, and frequently do. So we need to be cautious. Josiah has the right understanding, wrong direction. Goes out, fights with Necho, dies on the plains of Megiddo, and hence the proverbial expression of Megiddo, almost like a Waterloo, like we were saying last week. Well, once Necho had disposed of Josiah, he went north. He dealt with Josiah, and now he proceeds to Carchemish. And when he reaches Carchemish, he finds there the city under siege by the Babylonians. The crown prince of Babylon, whose name is Nebuchadnezzar, is there. He's not the king yet. His father, Nabopolassar, is still alive. But the city of Carchemish is under siege. And the last, as it were, vestige of Assyrian power is holed up inside. Little Ashurbanipal, probably about 15 years old now. So Necho comes and shows his stuff. And indeed, he is successful. And he beats off the Babylonians and sends them back to Babylon. One of the few times Nebuchadnezzar lost a battle. And he retreats. And Necho is the hero of the day. He rescues Ashurbanipal. We never know what happens to him, by the way. He kind of fades into the woodwork. But nevertheless, Necho becomes the power to be reckoned with at that time. He then he leaves a fairly substantial Egyptian army at Carchemish. This is all in 608. And turns south, heading back, and he's going to stop off in Jerusalem. Remember, he's just killed the most recent king in Judah. And so he's coming back more or less as a conquering warlord now to the Jerusalem that had once been under the reign of the king he just killed. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, what had happened was the people had, in the absence now with the death of Josiah, taken not the oldest son of Josiah, but the second oldest son, whose name was Jehoahaz, and made him the king in Jerusalem. The oldest son was named Eliakim. They passed over him. We don't know why. The Hebrew Republic, by the way, was not a clear-cut monarchy. There was this sense in which the people would choose the king. Now, usually it would be part of the kingly family, and indeed in the case of the house of David, it was always a member of the house of David. And yet there was a kind of republican or representative notion that shot through the civics, as it were, of Hebrew practice. So anyway, they pass over the first son, and they take the second son, Jehoahaz, and put him on the throne. He reigns there 3 months. And then guess who comes knocking at the door, you know? Hello, Necho out here. And Jehoahaz knows he doesn't have the stomach, the armaments, anything to go to battle against Necho. His dad has just been killed by Necho, and so Jehoahaz immediately surrenders. The better part of valor there, and basically caves in immediately to Necho. Well, Necho takes Jehoahaz, and after only 3 months of being king, and makes him a prisoner, puts him in chains, and hauls him off to Egypt, never to be heard from again. Jehoahaz probably dies in Egypt, and that's the end of Jehoahaz. Then Necho takes the older brother of Jehoahaz, whose name was Eliakim, changes his name to Jehoiakim. and places him on the throne in Judah, in Jerusalem. The reason that they would change the name is because that was a display of authority. You have the right to change the name of those who are under you. That's that's almost a human notion, but especially in the ancient Near East, that would be a common practice. So Necho changes the name of this guy, puts him on the throne, and that becomes King Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim is there basically as a puppet of Necho. He's going to pay tribute to Necho and is beholden, as it were, to Necho. And everything's fine then for about 3 years. However, after 3 years, Nebuchadnezzar comes back. This is 605. He's still the crown prince. His dad is still alive, but he comes with a much more substantial army back to Carchemish. That battle wasn't over yet as far as Nebuchadnezzar was concerned. When Necho hears of it, he musters his own army and once again goes to Carchemish to once again fight over that little outpost town on the Euphrates. This time, Necho is routed. It is no contest. He is defeated soundly and rather quickly by this overwhelming Babylonian force. He runs pell-mell back to Egypt. And he is chased by the Babylonian army with Nebuchadnezzar at its head. However, the Babylonians then stop off in Jerusalem on their way to Egypt. You see, going from north to south. And Jehoiakim, of course, recognizes immediately which way the political winds are blowing and realizes that while he has been basically a tributary to Necho, now he's going to have to shift his loyalties, and in fact he does so quite willingly. He's not up for a battle with the Babylonians. So he then willingly complies and submits to Nebuchadnezzar. Then Nebuchadnezzar proceeds to chase the Egyptians into Egypt, and probably in that time, in 605, Egypt would have fallen to the Babylonians, but for an unexpected development back home in Babylon. Namely, Nabopolassar died. And the death of Nabopolassar required that the crown prince Nebuchadnezzar just go back immediately to consolidate his position there. The death of a monarch was always a risky time for dynastic succession. All of that required that Nebuchadnezzar, go back immediately. So he abandons Egypt. Necho survives this. He heads immediately back, but he stops once again in Jerusalem on his way back to Babylon. He stops in Jerusalem to do what was common for the Babylonians. Namely, he wanted to grab some, as it were, trophies proving his prowess as a successful warrior. And so it appears from the text, it's not altogether clear, but this seems to be what happened. He actually took captive Jehoiakim and certain of the royal family, nobility in Judah, and took all of these back with him to Babylon. Jehoiakim only for a short time. He was reinstated to the throne quickly. But some of these others that were taken to Babylon were taken for the express purpose of being trained in Babylonian wisdom so that they could eventually be reinstated to their homelands, their indigenous land, as it were, people who knew the culture but also were loyal to Babylon, you see. Some of these people will be names you recognize, because one of the people that Nebuchadnezzar grabbed at this point to take to Babylon was named Daniel. His name Nebuchadnezzar changed his name to Belteshazzar. Some others you've probably heard of, Mishael, Hananiah, Azariah, whose names were changed by Nebuchadnezzar to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And others, you see, were taken. This is 605 that these men are taken back. And by the way, Judah was not the only place Babylon did this. This was kind of a common practice. And so the brightest and best from many of the lands that came under the Babylonian rule were brought to Babylon for training. And the idea was to so inculcate them with Babylonian wisdom that they would never stray from it, and then put them back in their native lands to be political leaders there who were nevertheless loyal to Babylon. Very, good strategy on the part of the Babylonians. So anyway, that's how Daniel and the three young men wind up in Babylon. And as I say, we're going to go back about several weeks from now and pick up the story of Daniel and look at what happens during these intervening years. But anyway, that's the basic setting. That's what's going on. And as we indicated, Habakkuk brings his message probably about 610, no later than 605. Commentators vary, but it seems that that's probably the time frame. Of course, there are some commentators who put him much later, some that put him much earlier. You can always imagine that. People have to get a PhD on something. And usually what they do is prove that the majority opinion is right, you know. And I think the majority opinion is right, that probably Habakkuk best belongs in that rather narrowly conceived time frame of somewhere around 610 to 605. Habakkuk's message really focuses on the distinctive threat that's represented by the Babylonians. That's his main concern. And the principal message of Habakkuk, probably the thing for which he's most famous, if you know anything about Habakkuk, you probably know this about him, that Habakkuk is the one that complains, why are you using those less righteous than us to judge us? You know. Why are you using those who are more wicked to judge us who are less wicked? Not that we don't need judgment. You know, Habakkuk's not trying to dodge the bullet. He just wonders how come God would use these more deplorable, idolatrous, wicked, ghastly Babylonians to chastise the relatively more righteous Jewish people in Jerusalem. So that's his main complaint. And you can see why he's saying that, because the evident threat of the Babylonians is now looming. Assyria is gone, but Babylon has risen in its place and represents this dreadful shadow across the entire region. All right, so with that, let's take a look at Habakkuk. As I say, it's page 871. You know, Don's question is, do you always go north to Babylon? On a map, it's almost due east, but it's due east across a dreadful desert. And so usually what they would do is follow the water route. And that would go up the edge of the Mediterranean, roughly, so on to the Euphrates, and then follow the Euphrates back down into what's called Mesopotamia. Yeah, Carchemish is kind of the turning point there. Yeah, right. Good. So let's look at this. We're on page 871 then, the prophet Habakkuk. Chapter 1, verse 1. The oracle that the prophet Habakkuk saw. Notice Habakkuk doesn't give us orientation to space and time, as some of the prophets do. So again, we are simply doing our best to locate this prophet as far as the particular time in history. However, there is more of a consensus on this than on many of these minor prophets, and I'm quite comfortable with the opinion that puts him around the date that we've suggested. This first section of Habakkuk, the first 2 chapters, it's only 3 chapters long, the first 2 chapters form one conversation. Habakkuk is a little different from the other prophets in that his message is not directed to the people. He's actually having a conversation with God. Although one commentator called it a colloquy. You know what a colloquy is? The first time I really thought about the word colloquy was in depositions. Because a court reporter, has to take down verbatim what everybody's saying. And lawyers like to, earn their keep by getting in arguments with other lawyers. And court reporters, it drives them nuts because you've got 4 lawyers and they're all squabbling with each other and he's trying to get all that down. And so usually what the court reporter will do is simply say, colloquy of counsel. What I realized is that what that means is it really doesn't matter much what was being said right there. It was just lawyers, And after a while, they get done and they've resolved whatever conversation they're having, and then usually a little break off the record, and then we start back with a deposition. Colloquy. That's a polite word for argument. And this is sometimes called a colloquy, only in this case, Habakkuk's colloquy is with the deity. He's got an argument. He's got a beef with Yahweh, the God of Israel, of Judah. And that argument proceeds for 2 chapters. So it's a very interesting, unusual kind of prophetic message because it is, in that sense, you see, a conversation with God. Then the last chapter is the second part of the book, And that is more the what you'd call a psalm or a prayer. It actually is a musical poem intended to be sung, and it seems to be Habakkuk's reflection on this colloquy at a later time. So 2 parts. First of all, the argument, then Habakkuk's later reflection on it. And we'll look at a little bit of both of these as we go. So let's start at verse 2 then of chapter 1. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not listen? You know, it's okay to pray like that. Sometimes we have such sanitized prayers. We don't realize the New Testament tells us, and the Old Testament agrees, we can come boldly into the throne of grace. And if we're in times of stress and turmoil and trouble, it's okay to voice that. To really give the inner anguish we may be going through in no uncertain terms before God is not only okay, but in fact encouraged. And here Habakkuk's praying a very godly prayer. God, when are you going to answer me? You know, he's angry. How long will I keep crying for help and you won't listen? How long will I cry to you violence and you will not save? This is an angry prophet. Now his anger at this moment is directed to the circumstances of the people in Judah. He's not thinking of Babylon right now. He's thinking of life in Judah. And he's complaining about the godlessness of the Jewish people. It is interesting because, of course, the Jewish people have been under the reign of Josiah for many years. And Josiah was a very good king and did everything he could to try to move the people in a direction of godly worship. And he'd been quite successful at the point of what you'd call the external or ritual side of life. He'd driven the idolaters out. He'd executed the priests of Baal. You know, he'd destroyed the high places. He'd done all of those things which got rid of the external indicia of idolatry. But the problem is, in their hearts, these people were still given to violence, given to robbing God of His honor. These aren't the words of Jeremiah, but it's a critique that Jeremiah could easily have brought. These people worship me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Jeremiah describes that quality of sort of hypocritical worship. And here Habakkuk is complaining about that as he looks at the people of God. Their heartless worship is still only camouflaging violence, greed, idolatry, wickedness. And so all of that becomes the concern of the prophet now. Why do you make me see wrongdoing and look at trouble? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law becomes slack. Justice never prevails. The wicked surround the righteous. Therefore, judgment comes forth perverted. So this is a critique that doesn't sound a whole lot different from the critique we heard from Amos, Hosea, some of the others. They brought similar kinds of critiques of the people of God. Worshiping externally, but their hearts far from, the true and proper disposition toward God. So that's the initial salvo here in this debate between the prophet and his God. And that's the complaint. And now in verse 5, we have God's initial response. Not what Habakkuk was probably expecting. And it comes in these words. All right, Habakkuk, I hear your complaint. I hear your argument. So here's my response. Look at the nations and see. Be astonished. Be astounded. In other words, Habakkuk, sit down. I'm not sure you're ready for this. Here's my answer. For a work is being done in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. My answer to your complaint, Habakkuk, is going to be so unexpected that you wouldn't believe it if you were told it. It's going to be so off the wall. It's going to seem so unlikely that you'll hardly be able to accept it. What is it? Verse 6. I am rousing the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans, of course, that's a regional title for the Babylonians. And so the reference here to the Chaldeans or the Babylonians, it's to that people. I am rousing the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous nation who march through the breadth of the earth and seize dwellings not their own. This is the story of the Babylonians, almost as bad as the Assyrians, but not quite. But they would go through and they would seize property and loot and plunder. And that was really the story of warfare in the ancient world, and Babylon was no exception. Dread and fearsome are they, and their justice and dignity proceed from themselves, not from some transcendent value, not from some higher sense of justice. Their dignity, their worth, proceed from their own power. They operate by the fundamental ethical axiom, might makes right. We're the biggest, therefore we're the best, the rightest, the most virtuous. Power establishes our authority. That's the way these Babylonians operate. And I am rousing them. I'm bringing them up. I'm feeding them power, as it were. Verse 8, their horses are swifter than leopards, more menacing than wolves. At dusk, their horses charge. Their horsemen come from far away. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence, with faces pressing forward. They gather captives like sand. You can imagine in the Near East, sand is a pretty plentiful commodity. And to say that they gather captives like sand is simply to say innumerable numbers of captives come within the scope of their efforts. In other words, these Babylonians are pretty rough people, pretty severe. And that's the picture that's being painted. At kings, that is, opposing kings, the Babylonians scoff. And of rulers, they make sport. They laugh at every fortress. The Babylonians were famous for their engineering techniques in destroying fortified cities under a siege. They had all kinds of equipment and siege machines and so on that could basically dispose of a siege in pretty short order. And so they laugh at every fortress. They heap up earth to take it. Those are the siege mounds that they would build. They sweep by like the wind. They transgress and become guilty. Their own might is their God. These Babylonians, they don't worship they don't worship the true God, certainly. They worship a pantheon of deities. But the bottom line is, what they really worship is their own extraordinary power. That's these that God is rousing here. Now, Habakkuk doesn't like that answer. And in verse 12, now the colloquy switches back, and this is Habakkuk's response. And Habakkuk, you can tell, is perturbed, a little distressed about this. And so in verse 12, wait a minute. Hold the phone here. Aren't you the one who is of old? Is this Yahweh I've got on the line? Aren't you the one who is eternal? Aren't you the one who is the great eternal deity who's the creator of all things? The Lord, my God, my Holy One, you don't die? Lord, verse 12, you have marked them, the Babylonians, for judgment. Wait a minute. Habakkuk's saying, what's wrong with this picture? They're the ones that are supposed to be under your judgment, not us, relatively speaking. And you, O rock, have established them for punishment. They're the ones who should be in trouble. By your own testimony, you've just talked about what wicked people they are. And how is it that you begin to talk about rousing them to come against us? And then verse 13, your eyes are too pure to behold evil. You cannot look on wrongdoing. Why do you look on the treacherous and are silent when the wicked swallow those more righteous than they? You see, Habakkuk was complaining about the state of affairs in Judah, but when he heard that God's response was going to take people even more unrighteous and used them as the whip to chastise the people of God. Habakkuk didn't like that. How can God use those who are less righteous than we are to judge us? That doesn't make any sense. It raises, of course, as you can probably imagine, a deep philosophical issue in theology that I can only just mention and not try to explore in any depth. But it's the whole question. What is happening here is God is saying, in so many words, I'm going to use these evil, wicked Babylonians who are, in fact, vastly more wicked than the Jewish people, though they were wicked enough at this point. But I'm going to use these more wicked Babylonians to chastise the less wicked people of Jerusalem. In ethics, we have a concept, an idea you've heard of, that's called the ends justifies the means, that little expression. And usually, most ethicists will concur that that's not a good ethical principle. That anybody who's going to engage in wicked means to accomplish a good end is on perilous ground. That's typically not something that we would endorse. And so, while I'm sure there are ethicists who would disagree with that, that's at least classically been more or less understood as a given. The ends does not justify the means. We almost recite that axiomatically when we hear circumstances suggesting it. And yet, isn't that exactly what God's doing here? He's using a wicked means, the Babylonians, to accomplish a good end, namely the chastisement of Israel or Judah. And so isn't God, in a sense, violating that ethical axiom by, doing the very thing that Habakkuk's complaining about here? Answer, yes. Yeah, as a matter of fact, he is. And so doesn't that mean that God is being unethical? Answer, no, it doesn't. And the reason, this requires much more discussion. I'm just giving it to you kind of quick and sketchy. But the reason is because there's a difference between being God and being human. We human beings are not God. Hence, we cannot control effects that flow from causes, absolutely. You see, I cannot necessarily dictate what the future will be. And so when I engage in an evil activity, even if my heart was that it might accomplish a good end, I cannot by any means guarantee that good will flow from my wicked actions. That's why we're much safer as Christian people to simply obey God and do what's good and let God care for the bigger scheme of things. But if you happen to be God, then you happen to be sovereign. And if you are sovereign, then you in fact can not only dictate the means, but the ends. And so you can use wicked means to accomplish good purposes if you happen to be the deity. There only happens to be one of them, you see. And to my knowledge, it's none of us. And so that's the difference. That's why the Bible doesn't just allow this, it teaches it emphatically. Genesis chapter 50, when Joseph responded to his brothers, what you intended for harm, God intended for good. It was a wicked means to a good end. You see, that's the classical statement of it. But it's shot through the Scriptures. God can use a Judas, who's a wicked man, to accomplish a good end, namely the sacrifice of Christ for the atonement of the sins of the world. Peter makes allusion to the same principle on the day of Pentecost. And on and on. I mean, we can stand here all day and cite verses for the proposition that God will use wicked means to accomplish good ends. But that is no justification for any of us to do it, because we don't have sovereign authority over the future as God does. All right, now back to the text. This is Habakkuk's concern, though, is that God is using here this wicked Babylonian nation to accomplish the chastisement of God's people. And the cognitive dissonance that's rattling around in Habakkuk's brain is the reflection of that is what we're facing here. Verse 14, you've made the people, that is we, us, Jewish people, to be like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. The enemy brings all of them up with a hook. It's like we're the fish. Here come the Babylonians with this great net, and they're just going fishing. And what are we against the armaments of the Babylonians and this great net that they're bringing? He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his seine, so he rejoices and exults. Therefore, he sacrifices to his net. He worships the means of his conquest. He worships his own power. That's not a God. That's an idol. Have you noticed that? God, you're using idolaters to accomplish your purposes. For by them his portion is lavish, and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and destroying nations without mercy? And I love this next verse. This is Habakkuk at his very best, in a sense. I will stand at my watchpost. I will station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch and see what he, God, will say to me and what he will answer concerning my complaint. And you just get this picture of Habakkuk standing out there on the gate of the city, and he's addressing himself to Almighty God, and he says, I think I've given you an unanswerable dilemma here. I'm going to stand here and see what you have to say. Don't you get that picture of Habakkuk? He's just angry. How are you going to respond to this? I've got you on the horns of a real dilemma here. What's your answer? Well, the answer that comes is really the entire text of chapter 2. And for the sake of limited time, I'm just going to give you the bottom line and then plead with you to read it a little later and see how eloquently it's put. But the basic point is that even though God is using the Babylonians on this ad hoc basis to accomplish his purposes, that is not exempting the Babylonians whatsoever from their own culpability. And indeed, this entire chapter is a reassurance to Habakkuk that they will get theirs. And the whole chapter, look at verse 6. Alas for you who heap up what is not your own, the Babylonians who were doing that. Verse 9. Alas for you who get evil gain for your houses. The Babylonians were doing that. Verse 12. Alas for you who build a town by bloodshed. Verse 15, alas for you who make your neighbors drink, pouring out your wrath. See, all of that was God giving assurance to Habakkuk that even though God was temporarily using them for the purpose of this chastisement, nevertheless, the Babylonians were not getting off the hook. They would face their day of reckoning. And indeed they did. In 539, as you know, it's Daniel chapter 5 is the story of this, when Babylon fell as precipitously as had Assyria. 539 under the invasion of Cyrus the Great. So that brings us then now in these last couple of minutes to the last chapter. And this is Habakkuk's prayer. It's as it were a prayer later, a prayer reflecting on what God had said to him. Beginning at verse 2. O Lord, I've heard of your renown. I stand in awe, O Lord, of your work. This whole experience reminds me a bit of Job, who you recall is complaining for 38 chapters, wanting his day before God. But when God finally shows up and speaks to him out of a whirlwind and says, who is this that's darkening counsel by words without knowledge? All of a sudden, Job isn't quite so huffy anymore, And he lays his hand on his mouth and he announces he's a worm and he's repenting in sackcloth and ashes. And it's sort of the same thing here. Even though Habakkuk had his huffy moment, getting in God's face, nevertheless, when God actually appeared and responded, Habakkuk was deeply humbled at the awesome presence of God and the fact that a sovereign God could indeed do the very thing that he was purporting to do. The really critical statement of this is over in verse 16. Let's go over to that. I hear, Habakkuk says, and I tremble within. My lips quiver at the sound. The whole idea was he was out there on that watchtower. He was waiting for God to respond. He was saying, I'll stand here and wait for God's answer. Let's see what you're going to say to my complaint. But then when God shows up, Habakkuk is shattered by the awesome, holy presence of God's majesty. Rottenness enters into my bones, and my steps tremble beneath me. See, this is Habakkuk now seeing that the one that he's taken on is Almighty God, and that God, in a sense, is above these ordinary complaints and objections that we raise to each other. I will wait quietly for the day of calamity to come upon the people who attack us. The people who are attacking us are the Babylonians. But given the assurance of God, I will wait quietly for that day when God's judgment comes upon them. These last few verses of Habakkuk are wonderful. They're worth memorizing. Just listen to them. This is, again, sounding somewhat like Job. Job said, you may recall, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Though God strips away everything from me, I will not be moved from my faith in God. And listen to how similarly Habakkuk states these words. Though the fig tree does not blossom, and no fruit is on its vines, though the produce of the olive fails, and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold, and there is no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer and makes me tread upon the heights. To the choir master with stringed instruments. It's the final instruction there telling us that that was indeed intended to be sung. But what a great statement. What a great statement of faith, you see. Because as Job himself said, God gives, God takes away. Everything we have is a gift from Him. God can forfeit any gift He gives us anytime He wants. And God can use things that would otherwise seem objectionable to accomplish His purposes just because He is God. And so the disposition of the Christian person from day in and day out is to accept everything that comes into our lives, even those things that come by wicked means, as those devices God uses for His great purpose. I know that's a bitter pill, and I realize for me to just stand here and say it is probably striking some of you as impossible to accept, and I appreciate that. But I just would, read Romans chapter 5. Paul says, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. We have access to grace. We have a hope of glory, and a hope in which we rejoice, he says. And then he says, we rejoice in our afflictions. We rejoice even in those things that are painful to us, realizing that even those things are designed to give us patience, to give us character, to deepen our hope and confidence. I think that's the lesson that Habakkuk learned here. It's a difficult one. It's a bit of a bitter pill. But I think in that setting, that was what God wanted to communicate to him. All right, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we're grateful that you give us this glimpse into the soul of the great prophet Habakkuk. If we're honest, we have to acknowledge that we struggle a bit with this message and what it means, that you would use wicked means to accomplish good ends, that you would use the Babylonians to achieve righteous purposes. And we know that each of us in this room have, as it were, Babylonians who are nipping at our heels. And we wonder, how could you use that person or that event or that force to accomplish your purposes? But we rejoice in the knowledge that you are the sovereign God and that nothing spins out of your control, and that all of these things can therefore be by your hand and in your great grace, those devices by which you move us toward holiness. And we give you thanks for it. Thank you for this prophet and for our opportunity to review his message this morning. In the name of Christ, amen.